Susanna Reid and The Guardian's deputy political editor, Jess Elgott.
Getting confused is that this year we are allowed currently to have Christmas parties. Last year, on December the 18th, they were criminalised and people were being fined for holding Christmas parties. And apparently there was a Christmas party or a party of some sort in number 10 Downing Street. Now, the official response is that all the rules were followed, but people can't understand if they were significant because firstly, lots of people were fined over having Christmas parties. Secondly, and this is critical for the government, there were people who were not allowed to see family members at that point. And the same day that there was apparently this knees up in number 10. And her daughter is saying, how did my mum die without me being able to be with her? But the people who were supposed to be protecting her were having a gathering. And that's one of the significant questions that the Prime Minister and the government have to answer.
Well, I'll be talking to the government. Understands how that's possible.
Nobody can understand how they had an exemption on this because they claimed that the rules were being followed. And the third reason why this is so important is because, as you say, the Sunday Times this morning, Tim Shipman, who of course is very well connected, knows the inside story on these things, chief political commentator, says that December the 18th, so exactly a year on, this year, Boris Johnson will make a decision about what is going to happen for this Christmas.
Just a few days before Christmas.
Set of rules, which is followed by those at the top. And so if he wants people to obey the rules, and at the moment there's quite a light touch of rules, there are masks, of course, indoors in shops and on public transport, and there are certain travel restrictions. But if he's going to introduce more rules which would restrict our Christmas, people could quite rightly say, well, hang on a moment, last Christmas you didn't follow the rules, so why should we follow them this Christmas?
Jessica, do you think we're at a moment...
TV, and his very last Life Stories interview is with Kate, and a huge amount of it, of course, is about Derek. Occasionally he'll say those three precious words, I love you. And it's just, it's such an emotional story. I was there in the audience with her children. And it's an incredibly moving story, and she's been so resilient throughout this time it's being sold. A drive to clean up Britain's crime-plagued streets. Cracking down on drugs, cracking down on this sort of crime is obviously going to play to his base. It's very popular, but there are a couple of extra lines in this piece. And Mr Johnson also promised action to create safer streets for women and girls and restore public confidence in the police, which was shattered by the murder of Sarah Everard by the Met officer Wayne Couzens. Questions to answer about why Wayne Couzens was able to do what he did when complaints had been made about him in the run-up to Sarah Everard's death. But I also think that there are questions to answer about huge cuts in the Crown Prosecution Service, and under austerity 20,000 police officers have been cut. So I think if you say the public are never wrong, if you ask the public, would you like more police officers, they would definitely say yes, in their thousands.
But for an awful lot of women, comments made in the street.
Harassed in that way in the street. But currently, rape convictions are at a terrible low. I mean, just a fraction of those people who go and report a rape eventually see a conviction. So if we could have more resources...
There are some measures coming in on that, aren't there, about pre-recorded interviews?
Absolutely, and he has pledged to change some of the rules about the evidence in order to make that, and that, I think, will be extremely welcome.
And I think it's worth saying as well that
the rules, how did the party go ahead? And so this is... she talks about the fact that most of the time Derek is not able to communicate with her.
Not able to speak at all.
Those from happening. So let's see what the Prime Minister actually does when he says the public are never wrong, because he's been fairly tone deaf on this so far.
We're nearly out of time, but just before we...
So the Speaker of the House of Commons says that he's concerned about it, and I mean, lots of the bars in the House of Commons have been closed over the period of time, but they certainly has been lots of incidents in the past in the House of Commons bars, including punch-ups and whatsoever. So maybe if there are a few sniffer dogs patrolling, we might get slightly better behaved MPs.
So is this a message that he's sending out to people closer to home where drugs don't work?
Because there's a terrifying piece of visualisation, piece of art in The Observer about this new Omicron variant. I don't know if it's realistic, but it looks like a kind of bristling Death Star from what they've drawn.
Yeah, it looks terrifying.
In the programme from South Africa. But let me ask you about the front page of The Telegraph, that pill because that is a piece of good news, I assume. What does this pill actually do, Jessica?
Yes, the pill is one that might otherwise have been given
shortly before Christmas as to what's happened. But there's also this really important story I mentioned about the Number 10 party. And ministers talk about this being tittle-tattle. But it's important, isn't it, because of people who are going to have to listen to the Prime Minister.
That's right. And I think there is this persistent point that the government makes one set of rules for all of us, but there is a special...
And will behave, as it were, less obediently than they did a year ago.
I looked at
the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, about this later on. But just to be absolutely clear, the dilemma we all have is how it is possible to have a party, you know, where drinks were being taken and games were being played and so forth.
Doesn't seem to have turned the dial that much. I think should be something quite worrying for the government.
Basically, if people are really, but if they're not, they may well not, particularly if the government isn't behaving.
People who's really been affected during this pandemic is my colleague Kate Garraway, of course.
We've had her on the programme, yes, talking about Derek Draper, her
because
husband.
He is one of the worst...
I don't know if the government regards it as a good news story, but they did make a change of policy last night, didn't they, on travel restrictions?
Yes, and already, of course, plenty of people in this country's Christmas have been ruined. We've got a big...
To get used to earlier in the year, and we all did if we were coming into the country or coming out of the country. Let's talk in The Sun with the Prime Minister. David Wooding of The Sun has interviewed the Prime Minister. The drugs don't work is the main headline. Just Susanna.
He says pestering women in the street of pubs and making lewd comments could also become an offence. Mr Johnson said there's a big public outcry about Sarah Everard's death. The public are never wrong. Well, I mean, he's absolutely right. There was a massive outcry. I think,
but it was a bit different, wasn't it? I mean, it's a slightly different issue from wolf whistling.
So to conflate the two is disingenuous. I mean, the Met have serious...
Low-level harassment in the street is part of a culture of hostility from some men, which is very, very damaging.
I'm sure that a lot of people will find that would make them a lot more comfortable, because it can be very uncomfortable if you're...
Tried to introduce this into the House of Commons before. They've tried to make amendments to make misogyny a hate crime, and the government has blocked...
You know, a story in the Sunday Times about drug use in the House of Commons at the same time as this middle class thing. Lots and lots of drugged up, coked up people staggering around the House of Commons, we read. And they're even bringing in sniffer dogs.
Yes.
Both very much indeed for that. And so to the weather. Chris.
We are